Legislators are interested in their pet projects, getting reelected, and popularity contest. Bud Grant, American professional football player and coach. All right. Welcome to another morning episode of the Liberty Dad podcast, a discussion on politics and culture. If you're tuning in live, then I want to especially thank you for giving me your time so early. I've kind of designated Mondays as my bill review day because what better thing to do than to start off the Monday mornings by talking about bills. I mean, how exciting is that? But let's see if I can keep your attention. Right? That's going to be the goal here. Now, today I'm going to review a House Bill 346. It's out of Delaware. It's related to uh, gender-affirming care. And what I want to do is I want to kind of go through three areas here, which is going to be a little bit different than the typical bill review. The first thing that I'm going to do is actually talk about the bill face value. I'm going to kind of look through it. It's not a very long bill. It's only like 3 pages. And we're going to walk through it and we're going to talk about some things, just the face value version of it. Then after that, I'm going to evaluate potential motives regarding the bill's sponsor, Representative DeShanna Neal. Now, this is a little bit out of the ordinary. I typically don't do this, but I think I think you'll see that there are some questions to be asked. And when it comes to bills, any bill, motives of the sponsor are always on the table. Now, we tend to think of those in terms of money, right? Like, all right, which lobbyist got to this lawyer this time? That's generally where we go with this. I think it's worth considering that maybe there are some family concerns to be had, or maybe some personal concerns to be had. Because again, if you're a legislator, you have some motive for pushing forward some bill. And that plays a role because when we evaluate a bill, we need to evaluate it. A lot of people kind of get worked up about what the intent of the bill is rather than like, okay, what is the evidence behind the bill? And what are the potential motivations of somebody pushing the bill? And it's a very easy conversation to have when you're talking about just money. Like, oh, looks like this group supported, their campaign and donated so much money, and now this representative wants to push a bill that just conveniently benefits this organization that donated a lot of money to their campaign. right? Like those conversations are easy, but today I'm going to kind of push the envelope a little bit, and we're gonna talk about some more personal matters with Representative Neal. And then after that, I want to just kind of go through and talk about some of the ramifications of this bill. So, what makes this bill so like why am I digging in so much? Well, let's take a look at the bill. Let's start there, and then we'll kind of walk our way through and see what we find. So let me go ahead and first and foremost put this bill up on the screen so that we can take a look, and then we will see what is in this bill, and just kind of have a conversation about it. So there we are. All right, move things around here up on my screen a bit. All right, so here's the bill, and like I said, the bill is only 3 pages, so it's not very long. If this is your first time tuning in, or if you're unfamiliar with reading bills, which many people are, and no shade, and you're everybody was always ignorant of something at some point, and then as you go along, hopefully you learn new knowledge and information. So when you're reading a bill, it's very, very common that the bill is actually longer than the portions that are being added or deleted to statute, to the code, right? And the reason for that is because a lot of times there's context in there. So what you're going to see, um, you'll see some things that are underlined. Underlined are items that are being added to the bill. And then other elements, other items in here may be existing code. And it's just kind of all added there, just kind of as to make it, to contextualize it, to make sure that you understand it, rather than just saying, all right, we're going to add this line to the bill. It'll say, like, we're adding this line here, and then it might show you some of the preceding text and the text after. So we get right into it here, and we can see that right on line 6. Well, let me read line 5, and we'll kind of focus on line 6 here. So it says, actually, let me back up to 4. The following definitions apply to this chapter unless otherwise expressly stated or implied by the context. And then we get into the addition. Gender affirming healthcare means medically necessary healthcare or mental health care that respects the gender identity of the patient as experienced and defined by the patient. Now, I find that kind of interesting because you might make the argument that the very first line before this addition here, um, gender affirming healthcare means medically necessary healthcare or mental health care that respects the gender identity of the patient. You might make an argument that that line would be would be a good thing, right? Like, hey, maybe some people do need gender affirming healthcare, and maybe that healthcare ought respect the gender identity of the patient. Now, you could argue with the word gender identity because identity is something that an individual chooses, which is in this following portion here, this clause right after it, where it says, as experienced and defined by the patient. So the first question that I have to ask about this is, like, does US law enshrine such language for other mental health issues such as depression, anxiety, so on and so forth? In other words, is there language in the law that says something like depression, healthcare means medically necessary healthcare or mental health care that respects the depressive state of the patient as experienced and defined by the patient? In other words, is the patient the one that gets to define depression or anxiety, right? Or is that something that is more correctly defined by the healthcare provider? So I want you to think of it this way. Let's say I go into the doctor and I tell the doctor, I'm like, I'm having heartburn, and I've been having some anxiety. What do you mean by anxiety? Well, and then I start describing my experience, and then I say, and I've got this backache, and I got these other aches and pains, and so on and so forth. So I'm describing to the doctor what I've been going through. And then the doctor can make an assessment and say, well, based on some lab results that we've done and based on some other tests that I performed, it would appear that the chemistry in your body, as far as we can tell, is functioning correctly. And it appears that you don't have any disease, you don't have this and something that that is unrelated to mental health. But then they might say, I believe that you have depression or anxiety, and that depression and anxiety is causing you these mental health issues, but then also is is causing problems with your body as well. This is why you're having heartburn and you're having these aches and pains. And I believe if we treat this depression or this anxiety, that we may see what we'll find is that it resolves some of these other issues, right? And so that would be the doctor defining your what you're going through, right? Like you come in, you tell them what you're experiencing, how you're feeling, right? You tell them your experience, and then they tell you, like, they define what that means. But here in this bill, it says as experienced and defined by the patient, which kind of suggests to me that it's enshrining in law that the patient gets to come in and says, look, doctor, I have a different identity. And then the doctor, therefore, has to approach all of their healthcare based on what the patient dictates. Right. And so I think this is problematic because that's not how we treat any other. Like, I went into the doctor and been like, man, I think I got this issue going on. The doctor's like, yeah, as it turns out, you don't. And, based on, their clinical assessment of me, right? And this happens all the time. People go in and they're like, "Doctor, I think I have this problem." And then and the doctor's like, "Well, actually, no, you don't. You have this other problem, or yes, you do." Right. But the doctor is the one that confirms this. But it seems here that the patient is the one who gets to define this and confirm it. And then the doctor simply has to treat based on what the patient has told them. It'd be like me walking in saying, I have MS. Well, the doctor says, instead of the doctor not being permitted to say, well, let me test you and let me evaluate you and tell me why you believe you have MS, it would be the doctor just has to treat me based on my experience and my definition. So, what does that end up meaning? Well, then it goes on and says, and that may include any of the following. And then it says, and when we're looking at lines 7 through 10 now, it says interventions to suppress the development of endogenous secondary sex characteristics. So this would be like your puberty blockers. Intervention to align the patient's appearance or physical body with patient's gender identity. So this again might be puberty blockers. This might be hormone treatment and presumably even surgical treatment. Interventions to alleviate the patient's symptoms of clinically significant distress resulting from gender incongruence. In other words, this might be, any kind of pharmaceutical that helps deal with, like, say, the depression that somebody may be experiencing because they believe that, hey, I was born a boy, but I should have been a girl. Um, but what's interesting, what's not in here, and we can actually go down a little bit further here, what I don't have highlighted, D, developmentally appropriate services as decided in collaboration between the patient, their clinical team, and the current best practices recommended by the World Professional Association for Transgender Health. That would be WPATH. You might have heard of that. But what's not in here is any provision, since we're putting this into law, there's no provision for the doctor to say, well, you actually don't have, like, that's actually not applicable to you. I know that you might be feeling like you're a boy, but as it turns out, you have this other issue and you're conflating it. And I think this is important because we're enshrining this into law in the first place. But we seem to only be enshrining here what is what a patient might want, rather than telling the patient no. Like, that doesn't appear to be enshrined in here. So what where does this leave doctors? Is my first question. Do Would doctors be would they be legally in trouble if a patient came to them, whether it was an adult or a child, and said, "Hey, you know what? I believe that I have a gender incongruence here," and they would probably just go in and say, like, "I believe that I'm, my gender identity is this thing, whatever this is," right? And would the doctor say, "Okay, well, let's walk through this. Tell me about your experience. Tell me about how you're feeling. And then after hearing from the patient, imagine that the doctor says, well, based on my clinical assessment, you don't have a gender identity issue. You have something else, whatever that something else is. And now, would the doctor be in trouble legally because that's not the experience and definition as given from the patient? And I think these are important questions that we have to ask, right? And since it's not here, I would presume that a doctor may find themselves in some level of trouble. All right. So we move on down the line, and then it kind of under D here, it kind of reiterates. It says treatment that provides exploration and integration of the patient's gender identity. Number three, services or treatment to increase family acceptance of the patient's gender identity. So I'm not even clear what that means exactly. We would have to go and look at WPATH's recommendations, and that's I started looking into WPATH just to see if there was any information that I could present here on the podcast. And unfortunately, there was way too much information. I just didn't have enough time to address anything. So, but again, we're putting this into law. This is part of it's almost like we are adding to law the specific way on which a doctor must treat somebody. Now it does say developmentally appropriate services, but again, we're not putting into law alongside, hey, you need to treat them based on their identity doing these things. We're also not putting into law saying, well, you might also find that this person doesn't have a gender identity issue. And that is also a path that we're going to enshrine into law. So it basically, there's no provision for when a patient may be wrong about their defined concerns. So we move along. We go down here to number 29, to lines 29 and 30. And again, you can see here where you've got some underlined stuff and some things that are not underlined. So we go here and we see that it says limitations and protections against actions relating to the termination of, and they scratch out pregnancy and then they add pregnancy and gender affirming healthcare. So this was kind of interesting because what they're effectively doing is they're putting into law that abortion is the same exact medical treatment as is gender affirming healthcare. And I think that's problematic because, again, as I just pointed out, the bill does not have any provision for when a patient may be wrong about their diagnosis. But then it goes on to say, well, pregnancy and gender affirming healthcare, those are the same things. However, pregnancy is, if you want to call it healthcare, I know some people would argue with that, but it's treatment, we'll put it that way. We'll just use that simple word. We're not going to get into the pregnancy abortion debate and all that. But pregnancy or abortion or pregnancy specifically, because let's see, where is it here? Yeah, so they're if you want to terminate your pregnancy, so on and so forth. But pregnancy is I don't want to say a condition. I don't want to say a condition because condition kind of sounds like uh, an illness or something like that. But pregnancy is a medical, drawing a blank on the word I want to use. So we're going to use condition for the lack of a better word, but that is not what I mean. I'm just drawing a blank on a better word that I would prefer to use. But pregnancy is a diagnosis. Pregnancy is a diagnosis that we can verify. And you can tell the patient they're either right or they're wrong about it. Okay. So imagine a patient comes in and they say, Doctor, I think I might be pregnant. Well, the doctor can do some tests and then he can say, it turns out you're not pregnant. Or the patient could come in, somebody could come in and say, yeah, I've been having all these things. And the doctor might say, sounds like you might be pregnant. And then the patient can go, they could define their, uh, you know, they could define their diagnosis, right? They could tell them about their experience and say, nope, I'm not pregnant. The doctor could say, well, let's run some tests. And the doctor could come back and say, I know you said you weren't pregnant, but you are. Likewise, the doctor could come back and say, well, I know you said you might be pregnant, but you're not. That doesn't seem to be the case when it comes to gender affirming healthcare, especially since above here at the very top, this is, as experienced and defined by the patient. So the patient gets to define this, right? And the question is, does the doctor have the opportunity to say, well, no, your definition, your diagnosis is incorrect in the same way that they can with pregnancy? And so when and what they're doing here is they're saying what applies to pregnancy also applies to gender affirming healthcare. And so then it gets a little bit kind of weird here because it says limitations and protections against actions relating to the termination of pregnancy and gender affirming healthcare. So now we're looking at, now if you want to look at this at a more like English level, so this sentence is basically saying everything that follows underneath here applies equally. Well, when you look down here, it says a law of another state that authorizes a person to bring a civil action against a person that does any of the following is contrary to the public policy of the state, terminates or seeks to terminate pregnancy. So I would argue that these things need to be separate. Even if you look at them as relatively equal, they still need to be separate because pregnancy is something entirely different to any kind of gender affirming healthcare. Performs or induces the termination of pregnancy, knowingly engages in conduct that aids or abets the performance or inducement of the termination of pregnancy, attempts to or intends to engage in the conduct described in paragraphs A 1 through 3 of the section. So, in reality, I would argue, and this is kind of like out of the scope, but I would argue that this particular portion of the law isn't really about pregnancy, it's actually about abortion. And so this is like an underhanded way of enshrining into law abortion because they title it as, well, they do say termination of pregnancy. Um, but the problem here, again, is that we're conflating two entirely different things, right? Termination of pregnancy and gender affirming healthcare, because pregnancy is not the same as gender identity, right? Pregnancy, we can verify with tests and we can confirm those. And we can tell the patient, yes or no, you are or you are not pregnant. And there's not much to dispute there, right? Like if they were to come to court and say, well, the doctor said I wasn't pregnant. And the doctor's like, and the court was like, okay, well, did you say that? And the doctor might say, well, yes, I did. And then they might say, well, why did you say that? Well, because all of these standard tests have identified that no, they're not pregnant, right? Like this is a big problem, I think, in this law here that they're trying to conflate the two and make them kind of equal. Uh, Provides medical, surgical, counseling, or referring services related to gender family affirming healthcare. So this is that addition to this portion that now brings together pregnancy and gender affirming healthcare together as as basically the same thing. And I understand why they're doing it, right? Like they're basically saying, like, look, the treatment for gender affirming healthcare should be considered no different than the treatment for terminating a pregnancy. But I think that they are absolutely different, simply because you can verify one, you can validate one, where regardless of what the patient thinks, whereas you cannot do that with the other. All right. So moving along, let's see. I think that was it on this. So it's a really short bill, right? And that's all it does. But what's really interesting about this bill is that let me move some screens around here. What's really interesting about this bill is it's actually the second bill that Representative Neal has put forward. The first bill, which was the number of it is 230, was actually more in depth. And let me put something up on the screen there with that. Where'd you go here? There we are. Give me just a second. There we go. So let's see here. Fix that. There we go. Okay. So put that up on the screen so that everybody can see it here. And the title of this is Neal Strikes Gender Affirming Care Bill Will Introduce New One. Okay. And this is written by Betsy Price, March 12th. So this is like 6 days ago. A Delaware legislator who identifies as non-binary, we're going to get to that in a minute, on Tuesday asked to strike a proposed bill that would protect medical professionals who provide general affirming medical care. Representative DeShanna Neal introduced House Bill 230. Now, remember, the bill that I just read through was 346 in June of 2023 and asked on Tuesday for the bill to be dropped from consideration. Neal didn't give a reason during the session. I thought that was interesting. Efforts were unsuccessful to immediately reach Neal for comment. Neal already is working on a new, more up-to-date bill that would be introduced in the next month, said Taylor Green, Neal's legislative aide. HB 230 was already out of date, Green said. The bill would have given medical professionals who provide gender affirming healthcare the same protections that the state of Delaware already gives providers of contraceptive and abortion services, among other things. Now, this is where it's interesting. We'll skip down here to the very bottom. I don't want to read all of these. Um, this previous bill, would have given jurisdiction to family courts to determine custody disputes when a child is in the state to receive gender affirming healthcare and the provision of gender affirming healthcare is at issue in the custody dispute. And then it would also prohibit the state from enforcing an out of state court order that removes a child from a parent because the parent allows the child to receive gender affirming healthcare. And then it also would have prohibited insurance companies from taking any adverse action against healthcare professionals who provide gender affirming healthcare services. So the old bill contained everything that the new bill has in it, but more. It had prohibitions on insurance companies, and then it inserted itself into jurisdiction in the family courts when there is a custody dispute. And then it would prohibit the state of Delaware from enforcing an out of state court order that removes a child from a parent because the parent allows the child to receive gender affirming healthcare. So, in other words, if you had somebody in Florida who, like, let's say you had a dad in Florida and you had a mom in Delaware, and the mom allowed gender affirming healthcare of the child, and the dad might say, "Well, that's an issue for me," and he petitions the state of Florida. State of Florida says, "All right, here's a court order that removes the child from that parent because they gave them gender affirming healthcare," and then Delaware would be prohibited from enforcing that court order. Okay. So I think this is kind of interesting that she removed the bill because says the bill drew a lot of Republican opposition when it was introduced in the last weeks of 2023 General Assembly session. But in a majority Democrat legislature, it often doesn't matter what the Republicans say or want. Now, here's what gets interesting. The timing, though, is interesting. Delaware's legislative session runs over 2 years, and this one is 2023 to 2024. Introducing the bill last year meant it was still alive this year. If Neal introduces a bill in a month, it will have a little over 2 months to go through committees and be passed both the Senate and the House. If not, it dies on the vine and will have to be reintroduced in the next session, which starts in 2025. So I don't really know. Now, again, they said that they reached out to her. You never know about news media. Sometimes, an hour before they're going to publish something, they reach out and say, "Hey, can we have a comment?" And then they'll say, "Yeah, they didn't give us any comment." So it's possible that they didn't give her adequate time to respond, or maybe the way that they sent the questions kind of put her off, and she was like, "Hey, I'm not going to, I'm not going to respond to you." Who knows what the case is? However, the facts of the matter are she did withdraw a bill that previously had more provisions in it. And then now she's reintroduced a bill that has fewer provisions. And she did it in a way where it seems like it needs to be kind of fast tracked or it's not going to make it. Whereas the previous bill was already kind of out there and was and could utilize the fullness of 2024. My suspicion here is that she's playing politics and she maybe put out the first bill as feelers to see to gauge not really the Republicans because as this article points out and as people in Delaware know, they have a largely Democrat legislature. So what the Republicans say doesn't matter. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that all the Democrats are necessarily on board and that they're going to get all the votes. So my assessment here is that she probably put the first one out there with a whole bunch of stuff just to see what, kind of putting out feelers like what is what is the appetite for this bill and everything in it? And what do people think? And then withdrew the bill, knowing that that bill wouldn't get passed, and then submitted another bill that had fewer items in there. And and now whether or not she intends to get whether or not Representative Neal intends for the bill to go through this session, I can't speculate. My guess would be that this would be a way to kind of force support by saying, okay, well, I introduced this bill and it turns out, some of y'all didn't like it. So I removed some things. I put in another bill, and then you still don't want to pass that bill. You guys are opposing trans rights. So it seems to me that this just simply may be a game of politics, a game of showmanship, right? Which is how they all do it. Like, but people should be aware, right? If I was a citizen of Delaware, I would want to know when my representatives are playing games specifically so that I could call them out and say, look, find a bill, whatever bill it is, find some legislation that you feel is worthy, write it up as you want it to pass and put it out there and then debate the issues. And if you need to remove something through the course of debate, then you do. If through the course of reviewing the bill, it's determined that, people just aren't on board with it at all, then the bill dies. End of story, right? Like I wouldn't want them playing these kind of political games. And we have to know that, I think the citizens, since DeShanna Neal apparently did not put out any kind of comment on this, at least in whatever time frame that the media gave her, I think it's worth the citizens demanding an answer and saying, why did you remove that bill specifically? And why does the new bill have fewer provisions? And then also, ask questions about the bill itself. Kind of going back to what I said a few moments ago, like, um, does this bill in any way prohibit a doctor from saying to a patient, no, you don't have gender identity issues? Or does it enshrine it into law that when a patient comes in and says they have gender identity issues, that the doctor has to take that at face value and simply provide some level of treatment for that? Right. Like, these are the kind of questions that citizens of Delaware need to be asking. All right. So that was a little bit of comparison between the two bills. And I think these are the kind of things that we're going to want to ask ourselves when we're reviewing a bill. Uh, and this is only a 3-page bill. So any person could read the bill. And the prior bill was only like 4 pages. It was a little bit longer because it had more provisions in it. So this is why I do the bill reviews, because I want you to see exactly how easy it is to read a bill and ask questions. I'm not a lawyer. So if I can ask these questions, then, a lawyer can ask even better ones, right? And this is the kind of things that citizens need to know about and need to be asking when they're reading these bills. They say, what does this mean? Right? How can I support any representative who's passing or forwarding legislation on my behalf if I don't at least read the bills and start asking questions and can't and get answers from that representative? And Representative Neal should be able to answer any question about the bill, because why would you sponsor a bill that you're unclear of the ramifications of, right? At least the immediate legal ramifications. And we're going to talk more about ramifications here in a minute. But right now, I'm just talking about the legal ones, right? That are from the direct reading of the bill. Now, this is the point in the podcast where I kind of step away from simply reviewing the bill, and I'm reviewing the bill's sponsor. And as a rule of thumb, I tend to say that families are generally off limits when we're criticizing politicians. But in other words, like, if you have a politician and say, and like I'll use something that's long ago, years ago, you might remember Sarah Palin was running as for the vice president position, and she was a big advocate. She was the governor of Alaska, and she was a big advocate of abstinence abstinence only education. And it turned out her daughter, can't remember her daughter's name at the moment, but her daughter at 17 got pregnant. And so a lot of people were, like, bring it up. Well, it's fair to question and say, like, look, in your house, you couldn't manage to maintain somebody, your teenage girl from getting pregnant, but you're trying to pass legislation that would limit sex education to abstinence only education. Maybe you need to clean up your own house before you worry about other people, legislation that's going to impact other households, right? Like, it clearly didn't work in your house. Why would you want to put it into law so that it would may or may not work in somebody else's house, right? And so that's not like a direct legal ramification. Like, are you going to be in trouble with the law? That's more like, okay, how does the law actually end up playing out? And it's a question based on not the daughter. So we're not criticizing Sarah Palin's daughter for her decision, but we are criticizing Sarah Palin for promoting an idea that she couldn't seem to manage her own self. Okay. So I want to make that very clear that we have done this in the past and I'm doing this now, but it's not a criticism of Representative Neal's children. But I am going to bring her children into this conversation because she has put them into the conversation. So I want to pull up a couple. I want to pull something up here really quickly. This is because I was doing my research and I saw some things and I was like, kind of interesting. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at this first image here. This is a screenshot. So let me cut to this and let me set it up here. So this is a screenshot of a post that Representative Neal made in 2016, in June of 2016. Now, if you're not familiar with Representative Neal, she has 4 children. And she came to prominence because her oldest child, they're all boys, they were all born boys. We'll leave it at that. Her first child, around the age of 3, she described as exhibiting wanting to be a girl very strongly. And there's some interesting things that allegedly had happened. Like, apparently she found her 3-year-old trying to think of how to say this on a somewhat family friendly podcast, using a pair of scissors in a very unpleasant way. Okay. Put it that way. You should understand. So, um, so that's where she became prominent because she had this incident happen. She started reaching out to social workers allegedly, and then she started going down this path and saying, "Okay, well, my child is transgender," and her child went from being named Xavier to Trinity. So, what I found interesting in some research is that there are some stories that don't match up. Okay, there's some things that just are inconsistent. And that makes me kind of wonder about the representative. And then there's some other family issues. So let me read through this. And it's kind of long, but I want to read it to give proper context. Okay. So she's writing about her child Trinity and the experience that she had. And she said, and we named her Trinity finale, right? So there's like a series of posts. You don't have to read all of them. It's just like the long, whole story. So here we are with this question. Do you want a happy little girl or a dead little boy? So this was allegedly told to her by somebody that she was sent to get help regarding these trans issues. Now, I've expressed in the past strong objections to this. Do you want a happy little girl or dead little boy? Because that is emotional manipulation. But that's not what we're going to talk about here. But I just want to address that very quickly. I believe that question, which seems to be pretty common when you hear people's stories, they're like, well, I was asked, do you want a dead little girl or a happy little boy or whatever? And that's emotional manipulation and it needs to stop. So moving on, perhaps there are some parents who would have taken the latter, but not us. Okay, I'm not even going to address that. That's we love our children. We wanted our children to be happy again. We made a decision to save our baby's life. It was so first of all, It's presumed, okay? So when they make these kind of comments, the presumption is there's a high rate of suicide in the community, and so therefore your child, if they identify as trans and you don't give them the gender affirming healthcare, then they're going to go on to commit suicide. So that's where this is coming from. Okay, so Friday when so it was a Friday when after we sent our two little ones to the learning center, my husband and I went to the store. Our goal, find the outfit for our soon to come home daughter. We bought a pack of panties, brown tights, Mary Jane shoes, and pink and brown My Little Pony dress. Getting home, we laid out the outfit on her bed. What do we call her? She doesn't respond to Xavier anymore, asked my husband. I thought on a dream. Hmm, I thought on a dream. Now, this is where the inconsistency comes in. I thought on a dream I had when I was pregnant with her. I had just found out that I just found out that day that I was having a son at an ultrasound. That night I dreamed I was in labor in a room of blue, but the walls began to bleed. They did this until finally stopping and the whole room was pink. I woke up freaked and my husband and I took a walk. We passed a church in my neighborhood called Trinity Baptist. I told him we would give our child the middle name Trinity because it's what our son wanted to tell us he needed. I didn't know why, but I felt it's what he wanted me to do, despite people saying it was a girl's name. We kept it. Okay. All right. So then we move on to the next screenshot. This is the same post that she made on Facebook. I knew then, 4 years later, why I gave my child that name. We will call her Trinity. My husband smiled, and we waited for the bus to bring home our two children. We were bursting with excitement when we started our walk with them back home. Lucian was talking about making a worm out of Play Doh. Trinity, well, she was silent, her thumb in her mouth, and not wanting to participate with the conversation. We got to the door of our apartment, and I paused. Uh, Xavier? Nothing. I took a deep breath. Trinity? For the first time in months, she looked up at me. Yes? Holding back my tears of happiness was very hard to do. She spoke. She spoke. Daddy and I got you something. It's on your bed. She nodded. And because we know having multiple kids means making sure the other has something too, we had a little toy on Lou's bed as well. Bear with that. We went into the apartment and waited in the living room while she walked into her shared bedroom. Lou came out first, waving his toy happily, but we didn't hear anything from Trinity yet. A few seconds later, felt like forever, ticked by, and finally a loud shriek. She came running out, clutching her clothes, and she was smiling and crying. Do you like them? I asked. Daddy just smiled. You were so quiet, and we didn't know if you liked them. I love them. I just pinched myself a few times because I thought maybe I was having a dream. Are they really for me? We nodded and I helped her put on the outfit. She would not take it off. She played again. She laughed again. She lived again. Our baby was back. Well, hun, we'll wait until your fifth birthday to send you to school like this, okay? Her smile fell, but it didn't become sadness. It was a face of determination, of strength. No, I'm going to school as me on Monday. I'll never go back as Xavier. I am Trinity. Well, then I thought, well, then I thought, okay. I made quick calls to the learning center at that moment and told them I would be there to explain further on Monday. But from Monday forward, Xavier was not coming to school. Trinity was, and they better handle it right or deal with me. And they did. Keep this in mind. And Trinity thrived. She made friends. She tested out of her IEP. Lucian said a year later on his fourth birthday, he got his wish. His sister was heard and happy. I didn't think I wanted a daughter. I have one now and I love her. She is to me what we all should be: strong, kind, funny, brilliant, and most of all, she's Trinity. Okay, so this is her story that she's telling about this. And this is again, this was back in 2016. So I want to move forward to an article that was written about her from Delaware Online. So I thought this was interesting. This was written a year later. Okay. So keep this in mind that what you just heard, and now we're going to talk about this news article here. So let me put that back up on the screen. All right. So this is called A Child's Journey to True Gender, written by Margie Fishman. All right. let's get down here to where let's see here. Look, it was not a well-beaten path for the girl's mother, DeShanna Neal, with her baby barely out of diapers. She mounted a campaign to convince family members, daycare providers, educators, and ballet instructors that her child had the heart and spirit of a girl. Um, DeShanna wasn't the type who ached for marriage or kids, much less a high maintenance girl. She fancied herself a feminist. So, when the ultrasound tech announced that her firstborn would be a boy, there were lukewarm congratulations and a baby blue shower. DeShanna and her then fiance, Chris, both comic book geeks, named their baby Xavier after the founder of X-Men, who promoted peaceful coexistence and equality between humans and mutants. Trinity would be the baby's name, in a nod to the fierce female hacker from The Matrix, who escapes simulated reality. But wait a minute. In DeShauna's account, she said that they named the baby Trinity after Trinity Baptist Church when she woke up from a dream and was spooked, and then her and her husband took a walk. Interesting. Or maybe she only, yeah, they both took a walk and they were trying to, and as they took a walk, they were trying to identify, morning, my producers here, they were trying to identify the name. Hold on, champ. So DeShana thought nothing of it as she embraced her 2-week-old baby, her pudgy arms encased in wool sleeves. In that moment, she didn't care who she'd be or whom she'd love. She only knew that her little girl didn't come with asterisks and that anyone who tried to hurt her little girl would face the wrath of Mama Bear. But when her 3-year-old pointed to a picture of a boy and said, "This is my body," before pointing to a picture of a girl and declaring, "This is who I am," strange behavior for a 3-year-old, DeShana had no inkling how it all would unfold. Was this just a phase? And if it wasn't, who would they go to for help? And how would they pay for their balance to alter the balance of hormones coursing through the child's veins? Trinity was about to join less than 1% of the US population and be branded with a big bullseye. Let's see, going down here, where is it? DeShana kept slamming into brick walls while buffering her child from society's lack of understanding and empathy. The journey would severely test her mettle. She drew strength from her child who believed society just needed to catch up. People grow and evolved. And isn't love tucked into the word evolve? What's your name? Xavier. How old are you? 3. Are you a boy or a girl? I'm a girl. You need to fix your child, said the Wilmington daycare worker scolded DeShana and Chris. Your child is going to be gay. Trinity, this is interesting. Trinity, then known as Xavier, wasn't allowed back. Neither was her younger brother, Lucian, after he bit a classmate who called Trinity a sissy. Now, that's kind of interesting because, again, a moment ago, her own story was entirely different. In her story, she said that the name Trinity came from Trinity Baptist Church and that she was very well accepted when she went back to the daycare and that she thrived and that she was doing great. But this news article entirely butchers the story. Or is it her story that's butchered? One doesn't know. But there is an incongruence between these two stories. Now it's possible that the news article is flatly wrong. But I would imagine that Representative Neal would have made the effort to say, "That's not my story. You need to make some corrections." And the news story would make the corrections. So it sounds to me like Representative Neal has to come up with what is the real story here? Because there's a story that's been reported which differs in major details from the story that she wrote. The other interesting thing, so let's go back to some media clips, some Facebook clips. Apologize. Let's bring this back here. All right, so we'll go to the next one here. So in this one, dated May of 2020, Representative Neal says, almost 17 years ago, I got the title of mom. Didn't realize it. I didn't really want it, but hey, there it is. Over time, I became a divorced mom of 4 assigned, boy, am I having trouble reading today. Over time, I became a divorced mom of 4 assigned male at birth kiddos. But just being a mom wasn't what I became to these babies. One said, I'm a girl at 4. Then another said, I'm a girl at 9. Interesting. I grew as a soul with them. Thanks, Trinity, Lucian, Hyperion, and Thane. Love you all. I can't wait to grow more as you grow. Happy Mother's Day. So now she has 2 children who are trans. And then if we continue on, we see in this one here, it says, the recent attacks, and this is dated March of 2023, the recent attacks on our LGBT community, especially our youth, is nothing but hate. When I had firstborn Trinity, I promised several things: to love her unconditionally, to always have her back, and to never be her first bully. This followed with my 3 next children. I would have never thought that out of my 4 kids, 3 would fall under the LGBTQ spectrum. Now I'm a mom to 2 trans daughters, 19 and 12, and a gay son, 17, almost 18, and a silly Leo who loves to wear what makes him feel his best. I've homeschooled all 4 of my children, Trinity and Lucian, because there weren't protections for transgender kids in the early 2000s, and Hyperion and Thane because I want only the best. So remember, if we look back just a few moments ago, at one of the she said Trinity thrived. She made friends. She tested out of her IEP. And then Lucian, her younger brother, said a year later on his 4th birthday, he got his wish that his sister was happy and heard. So we have to ask ourselves, like, what's going on here? The stories don't seem to be matching up, not from her, not against the media, and not some of her own stories. In one story, she tells it where her daughter started thriving, was making friends, and then she had to pull the children out because apparently they weren't getting the help that they needed in the school system. So which is it, Representative Neal? Were your children doing well or were they not? And you could nitpick at some of the other details. I think that would just end up being nitpicking. I think we should stick to the major details and insist on answers to those. But there's one more thing. Here is her own bio from the state of Delaware. DeShanna Neal is a mother of 4, an activist for social justice reform, and an author. They have recently become the first non-binary elected official in Delaware. Well, that's interesting. So let's recap what we've got here. Representative DeShanna Neal gave birth to 4 boys. Of those 4, 2 became transgender, 1 became gay or turned out gay, however you want to describe it. The 4th one appears to be as expected, right? No change whatsoever that we can tell. And the mom is non-binary and she's divorced. Does anybody find that to be problematic in the same way that we once found it problematic that former Governor Sarah Palin wanted to push abstinence only education while her own daughter was not maintaining abstinence, right? See, this is the kind of thing that we should evaluate our politicians on and say, if your own house is not in order, then maybe you are not the right person to be forwarding bills. That you need to figure out what's going on in your house and get it straightened out before you enshrine things into law that will affect other people's homes. Because remember, the first bill that she put forward actually had a provision for taking custody of a child when there was a custody dispute based on the gender affirming care. And this was an interstate dispute. So if you had a parent living in Delaware and a parent living and the other parent living in another state where gender affirming healthcare was not permitted, and then there became an issue of custody, she initially put forward a bill that would say Delaware is going to assume custody, and that's a part of a larger conversation. And we're going to ignore court orders from other states to return a child to a particular parent, right? So she was forwarding legislation that would further add conflict into families, while her own family seems to be odd, to say the least. Because let me ask you, with such a small population, what are the odds that one mother who's described as a feminist, an activist for social justice reform, who didn't particularly want kids in the first place, according to reports, had a child with her fiance, the child becomes transgender, another child becomes transgender, she becomes non-binary, and she gets divorced. What are the odds of all of that happening? And she's the right person to be advancing legislation, to review legislation and say, this is good legislation and is going to benefit families. What are the odds, skipping the legislation, what are the odds of all that happening? What are the odds of a family where one person determines that they're non-binary and they have two transgender children and a gay son? What are the odds of that happening? I don't know what the numbers are. I tried to look up and research and say, okay, what are some of the odds? Like what are even the odds of having two gay sons? Seems to me extremely low. It seems to me that having all of those would be even more extremely low, like to the point where it doesn't happen. So low that you would have to be like the only person over 100 years to have this happen to, right? Maybe even more. I find it kind of odd. And I think this is the proper opportunity to question, not our children, right? The children are doing their thing. And and I'm not saying that the kids are or are not trans. What I'm saying is the kids may believe they're trans and they're kids. No shade whatsoever toward these children. But we should look at the mom and say, is your house in order for you to be passing legislation that's going to affect other people's houses? And I say the answer to that is no, it's not. Now, let me address this issue because I find it interesting that if you read and you look at her story, initially on, the husband seemed to be in support. And now the husband's no longer the husband. Now, there could be any number of reasons for that, right? Could be his own doing. It could be Representative Neal's doing. I have no way of knowing. So I'm not going to speculate. I think it's kind of interesting, but I'm not going to speculate why. He could have been just a bad dude and said, you know what? I don't like this, is dumb. And he could just move on, right? He could say, he could get to the point where he says, you know what? It's too much work for me. Like, I don't know. I have no idea why. It could be that she was the cause of it, right? Like, hey, I'm getting more and more involved in this activism and either you're supporting me or you're not. She could have said, hey, I'm non-binary. Turns out I don't need a man. I don't really know. I have no idea what the case is. But I will point out something. I want to point out something from Dr. Thomas Sowell. Now, he doesn't, to my knowledge, he doesn't really talk about trans kids a lot, but he does talk about Black families and he talks about fatherlessness. So I want you to see this media clip of Dr. Thomas Sowell. It's an old clip, and I don't remember the date exactly when he gave it. He was giving an interview with, I'm drawing a blank on it at the moment. Anyway, let's play it.
One more instance of this kind of retrogression, the family. Again, discrimination and disparities. As of 1960, this one, I just find this one heartbreaking. As of 1960, 2/3 of all Black American children were living with both parents. That declined over the years until only 1/3 were living with both parents in 1995. Among Black families in poverty, 85% of the children had no father present, close quote. So it's not the legacy of slavery that destroys the African-American family.
It's the legacy of the welfare state.
And by the way, we see illegitimacy rates rising among everybody.
Yeah, and in other countries.
And
the very same thing in England.
And what's the mechanism? Why does the welfare state dissolve the family structure?
For one thing, it makes it unnecessary for fathers to support their offspring. And in fact, it makes it counterproductive in many cases. A very poor man who might be able to support his family realizes his family will be better off without him. But on the other hand, someone who's strictly irresponsible, either the man or the woman or both, now pays no price for being irresponsible. The taxpayers pay the price. And actually, the harm done to the taxpayers, which is serious, still is not comparable to the harm done to the families, and especially the
To
children.
the kids.
Yeah.
All right. So, what does that have to do with the trans kids? When we make laws that affect families, we need to be very careful about these laws. And we need to think more than just what is the immediate impact, right? What is the legal impact here, right? So early on, when I read the bill, I said, look, it looks to me, and I'm not a lawyer, so I could be entirely incorrect, but it looks to me like this bill kind of enshrines into law that if a patient comes in and says, I have gender issues, that the doctor has to treat them for that. And it does give discretion on how they treat them, but that they have to, right? Because that's what it said. At least that's how I read it. And Dr. Soul points out that legislation in the 60s, which was intended to help people, actually had a negative consequence, right? It was a trade-off. You get some help here, but it destroyed the family. And Dr. Soul and Dr. Williams, another economist, who both have written extensively about, both of them are economists, and both of them have written extensively about policies in the 1960s. Both of them have pointed out that the Black family has survived very well in terms of a two-parent home well after slavery, until about the 1960s. And then you start seeing, after legislation in the 1960s, you start seeing a disintegration of the family. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, with bills like this, what is the potential negative consequence that may happen, right? And should we be accepting legislation from somebody who doesn't appear to have their own house in order? No disrespect to anybody that gets divorced. Divorce happens. I get it. I've been divorced. And no disrespect to anybody that gets divorced who happens to have children. That happens as well. However, if you are a married couple and you have children, one or more children, and you get divorced, your child is now a statistic. Your child now has the world against them just by that very factor right there. And if the father isn't in the picture at all, it's even worse, right? So we have to be careful about the laws that we pass, because do we want to create more statistics? Do we want people who are in a position to be a statistic to be advancing legislation? Now, this is not an argument that you have to have the perfect family in order to make legislation, right? Like people come up with ideas for legislation based on their experiences. That is a very normal thing to do. But we want to make sure that somebody they're not putting their particular experience and maybe their thoughts and ideas into legislation, as opposed to saying there is a real problem here that needs to be addressed. And I've said this many times for every bill review. When we look at a bill, we should be solving an active problem. What is the problem that's being solved? Now, there are some other news articles where Representative DeShanna has pointed out that she made this legislation in response to other states making legislation. Well, that's not a reason to pass legislation in Delaware. Delaware needs legislation based on the needs of those living in Delaware. And any legislator that brings forward a bill should be able to explicitly say, regardless of what other states are doing, we need this bill in order to benefit or help people in Delaware. And here's how that bill does it. The other thing that I would advise citizens to do is to read the bills and then go and ask your representatives the hard questions and say, hey, what are the negative consequences of this bill? What are the potential negative consequences? And if that legislator says, well, there are none, or they can't think of any, then I would suggest to you that they don't understand the bill in total. They don't understand the ramifications. They don't understand the potential legal ramifications. They don't understand the potential social ramifications. And it's been well documented about the Black family and 1960s legislation. It's well documented. You could argue it, but it's well documented. It's a question out there to have. So that's my bill review today. In my opinion, I think this bill needs to get rejected, and I'm not going to suggest that Delaware seek to remove her, but when she comes up for reelection, I think maybe Delaware might look for somebody else who appears to have their house in a little bit better order, and whose stories are matching up, and who doesn't seem to have just some odd things going on about their family. Because from where I'm sitting here in Florida, it looks like you've got an activist in your legislature. That's it, an activist, somebody who's pushing an agenda, not really somebody who is saying, my family experienced this negative thing, and by golly, I want to make sure other families don't experience this as well. I think this is more activism, not activism for the sake of being activist, not for the sake of helping ensure that somebody else doesn't have to go through what they went through. That's my take on this bill. And this bill should flatly be rejected, whether it will or not, I don't know. And I think people in Delaware need to be mindful why the previous bill was stricken and why this new bill was put forward, especially given the time frame that it was. And you can go back if you're tuning in late, you can go back and hear what I said about it being the 23-24 legislative session. So anyway, folks, that's my show for today. I hope you found it informative and inspiring. Hopefully you're inspired to read some of these bills yourself. Start asking tough questions. Be sure to catch me Monday through Friday, 7 a.m. ish. I'm really working on it, folks. I really am, for an informed discussion on politics and culture. Make sure you are subscribed to my YouTube channel, or if you prefer, my Rumble channel. You can go to youtube.libertydad.com. You can go to rumble.libertydad.com. While you're there, drop me a comment and let me know how I'm doing. Last but not least, I want you to remember, if you're a champion of liberty, your business is people and your product is liberty. I want you to have a great week. Catch you tomorrow. But for now,